Hello, everyone, and welcome to Subs and Interview with. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Kellie Noon, who is a mix of different things, actually. A language teacher, a kind of a communications consultant, but actually specializing in unconscious bias and inclusivity, which I have no idea, Kellie, what that really means. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit better than I can?
Oh, I wish I could introduce myself a bit better than you, David. Yeah, no, that is it really. It's kind of a mix of everything. So I started out being a language teacher and I did that abroad for a very long time, teaching people English. So when I came back to Manchester, I set up a language school and it's all kind of evolved from there really, because I do obviously communications training. So I teach people how to speak in English. Then I teach people who speak English very well how to communicate more clearly, which is funny because it's something I struggle with myself. And then that really leads into teaching people how to understand those communication differences. So I do a lot of training around intercultural communications and why we do things differently. That's also connected to then being understanding. So that diversity and inclusion is a big part of businesses nowadays. And I do a lot of work supporting them to understand that all of the diversity that we have, different people in the same country and then people that come from abroad as well, is really beneficial. So diversity is great for us. It's understanding all of those differences between different people. And the inclusivity part of that is accepting everybody on their own terms and really understanding that every individual has something to bring to the table. If you have a company and you have a lot of diversity within it, what you don't want to do is make sure that everybody conforms to that company culture. No, the inclusivity part of it is accepting everybody for exactly who they are. No, and getting the best out of everybody because they are different and they all have something different to bring.
So on a day-to-day basis, what do you do then? So if you can put it into a pigeonhole it, or is it
Yeah.
pigeonholable?
Yeah, I suppose it is really. What I do mostly is, well, now it's changed a little bit and it's all online, but generally what I used to do until 3 weeks ago when the world has changed is go into different companies and actually into universities as well and train them in different areas. So a lot of the work is training people around mostly unconscious bias.
Okay.
So understanding why we don't like to engage with certain people, or we have, judgments about people that are very difficult for us to get past almost before we can engage. So it's basically going and delivering that kind of training. And then depending on which area people are working in, they'll need support in different things. So some of people will need support in, if it's more business focused, understanding their unconscious bias and then being more diverse and inclusive because it brings a lot of business benefits. I love working in universities and schools is then understanding more the intercultural side of it. So why different people are engaging with us in different ways and how we can use that to build stronger communications. Because of course,
So
people work
how
in
did you get into
universities.
this then? Obviously, we've got a little bit of a better understanding of what you do. How did you go from language teacher to
Yeah.
this? And what languages can you speak, by the way? How many?
Oh, I should be able to speak a lot more. I did my degree in Spain.
Okay.
So I'm perfectly fluent in Spanish and also Spanish translator. So I'm very comfortable with that language. I can switch in and out of it perfectly. But my degree is actually in French.
Okay.
So in theory, my French is excellent, but actually it's very, very rusty and I get very panicked when I have to talk in French. So Spanish and French, and then of course I've done quite a lot of Italian as well because it was one of the additional languages we had to study. And
I'm going to
then
pause
things
you
that
there.
are really interesting.
Can I
Oh,
pause? All right, sorry about that, Kellie. We had a little bit of a technical issue there, but we're back on track now. So you were telling us, obviously, how fluent you are in Spanish and French, and becoming a teacher. But I guess how did that convert into unconscious bias and the consultancy side of cultural differences?
so really one of the big things that I noticed was when I started working back here in the UK, I had a lot of clients who were really quite high up in jobs like engineering. I don't know why, but I ended up with loads of people in engineering actually. And they would come every week and I'd sit down with them and help them with things that they were preparing or reports. And just hearing people constantly tell me about the problems that they were having in terms of people not supporting them, people misunderstanding them, people ignoring them, people telling them they were wrong when actually they were right. And it became very apparent to me that we have a real problem in this country with a lot of those things. And it's not because people are aware of what they're doing, it's just that people seem to think that they're correct.
Mm.
And it was really difficult for me to, because I obviously get to know my students very, very well and I'd be helping them a lot. And you'd hear them tell you these horrible stories about how people just didn't understand them at all. And I thought, I really should be doing something about this because actually learning to communicate with people who speak different languages is really easy. There are a few simple things that we can do to adapt our language to speak a lot more clearly. So I started doing that, and I actually started working with a few other companies locally, and we were delivering training in what's called simple English or clear communications. And obviously people start to ask me questions.
Is that the kind of English I speak to my sons in? Simple English?
Not, probably not actually. And this is something that people always think, because you always think, oh, if I'm learning French or whatever the language is, I'll read a children's book because they're shorter and they're simpler. But actually the language that we use at home and the language that we talk to children in isn't an official normal version of standard English normally, because you have, familiar words that you use or jargon or slang, and it's actually very difficult. Okay. So probably the things that you speak at home or speak simply.
I am talking about dealing with teenagers, and actually you say it precisely or concisely and loud enough with enough emphasis on your face on how serious you are. So
I mean, the face does help. Yeah.
So obviously, I'm kind of digressing, and I apologise.
No, don't worry.
How does being online and communicating with someone from a different culture online differ now from when you could have the face-to-face meetings?
I mean, if it's online and you've got the video like we have now, then really it should be, I say, as straightforward as a face-to-face meeting. But of course, there is a big part of that you can't maybe understand. A big part of communicating with people are other areas that we don't necessarily take into consideration as clearly when we're talking face to face. So how close you might stand to somebody and how comfortable somebody is with that. The way that you would greet them as well can give you a lot of information as to how close somebody might be, in terms of as well how open they're going to be with what they tell you and what they don't tell you. People can come across as extremely friendly and warm, but by not saying things, they're showing you that there is a distance there and there's a lack of trust that needs time to build, and particularly people from what we would call higher context cultures. Mm-hmm. Lots of East Asia, it takes them a very long time to build that trust, and what they'll talk to you about is a lot less than what you would expect, because they come across as very warm and they'll stand very close to you and they'll shake your hand or they'll give you a hug or 2 kisses. But then what they'll tell you in terms of detail is very different. And that online sometimes can be quite difficult to understand, because Japanese people, for example, tend to not want to say things to you. They don't want to say no to you. So they'll tell you no in lots of very roundabout ways. And really, you need to be able to read all of the body language to understand that what they're telling you is no. And that, when you turn that into an online communication format, is very different, because of course there's a lot there that you can't see. You can't see how they're moving their hands, or how they might be moving away or moving closer, and it removes a lot of that.
Interesting. So are we talking big businesses dealing with this, or are you talking about small businesses? So if I literally run subs business events and we've got a few group leaders, how would unconscious bias affect us perhaps?
Okay, so hopefully if you're running a group of people, a subs meeting with a group of people that you know, a lot of the unconscious bias is hopefully by that point being removed, because they're people who you've chosen to deal with and chosen to work with over a longer period of time. So you'll already have a clearer understanding of who those people are and how they're going to interact. If you are somebody who takes things very seriously, you could, if you see the children kind of running around in the background, get quite upset about that and quite annoyed and think, well, they're not taking it seriously. But without having the conversation with them and understanding that maybe the children are running around because they're all in one room at the moment because the husband's in the other room on a business call, then, unconscious bias can start to play into that, because you think, well, they're not taking it seriously. How dare they? Whereas if you really understood the full situation, you'd say, well, that's not what's happening. That isn't the case. And that's a very simple example of things that might be happening to us every day, but unconscious bias can affect everything. And actually, a big part of unconscious bias is who we choose to engage with. Quite often, we will not talk to certain people, not because we're consciously choosing to ignore them, but because we don't see ourselves reflected in them. And so we don't see an affinity there. And that affinity bias will stop us from having that first contact with them.
How interesting. It is interesting. So how do we get past that then as a human race? Do you think this is generational? I mean, I daren't even say on camera what one of my late grandmothers used to say. But again, in today's society, it would have no place. It would be completely frowned upon. And obviously, I didn't share the views of any of my immediate family, but grandparents, they were a different generation.
I say grandparents and even parents at times. There are conversations that you have and think, yeah. I mean, so really, the big thing around unconscious bias that we all need to understand very clearly is that it is unconscious, and a big part of it comes from thousands of years ago when we needed to protect ourselves and we didn't have ways to communicate with people that weren't part of our in group or our safe group. So really, the snap judgments that we make, a lot of them we can't stop happening. So learning to deal with them, first of all, you have to be aware of them. So you have to start to realize that these things that you've done naturally your whole life and never thought about might be causing problems. And it's even things that are so subtle as, like I said before, you're not engaging with certain people. You might just think, in your head, you're thinking, oh, they've not come close enough. But actually the real reason is because you've not seen them and wanted to get closer to them. So it's a bigger problem, we realize, but it is unconscious, and dealing with it's very complex. So what you have to do is start to understand all the different areas of bias that are playing out in our daily lives, and then start to become aware of your own biases and your own ways of viewing the world. And so you need to really sit down and do that in a supportive environment where you can look into different aspects of daily life and how things around you happen or don't happen based on what you choose to engage with and choose to ignore. So there's quite a lot of activities that I do, and one of them is I give people a very uncomfortable list of questions, and I say, until you're happy talking about it, do it in your head. But things like, you get on an airplane and there's somebody sat next to you who's considerably overweight, what's your initial reaction? Or you walk into the supermarket and you see somebody with a veil over their head, what's your initial reaction? And they're very uncomfortable questions because they're things that people don't want to admit that maybe they're not comfortable with. But until you start to realize which areas make you go, even just a tiny bit, you're not aware of that unconscious bias that you carry. So it's really dealing with things that people hate to talk about and hate to admit to, but you have to start to get over that.
So interestingly, which cultures do you think are the worst at doing this? So are Brits particularly bad because we make assumptions all the time? And during lockdown at the moment, gosh, if someone sees four people together that might be a family living together, there are assumptions made all the time. We jump to conclusions as Brits, I think. Are we the worst? Are we not alone?
No, everybody in the world has them. It's just people see things from a different perspective, but everybody has the same bias, the same judgments, the same everything. Even people who spend their lives training in these areas have lots and lots of unconscious biases. And there's a process where you become aware of them to become more conscious, but then actually dealing with them and stopping them happening is extremely complex. I mean, we see the Brits generally, we're in a very privileged position really, because when you look at cultures around the globe, we can split them into two groups. And obviously this is a big stereotype, but we can split most cultures into low context cultures or high context cultures. And low context cultures are cultures, the typical example of that would be Americans. They're very loud, they're very open, they're very direct. They have no qualms about saying exactly what they're thinking. They can go into a business meeting, meet somebody, trust them and walk away. Whereas higher context cultures need a lot more time for relationships to develop. They're a lot quieter. They're more private with their emotions. And the UK, for most of the different areas that we can examine when we look into these different things in more detail, we fall kind of in the middle. So we have a very privileged vantage point because we're neither high context nor low context, because we've had such a big history of colonizing the world and taking over different places. And we've learned so much from all these different experiences that we're very good at seeing things. Obviously, there's always people who do it differently, but we can see things very well.
Who would you consider as high context then? Is that would be your Chinese, Japanese?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and lots of cultures that are high context are cultures that have a very, very strong historical tradition, very long traditions that haven't really been interrupted. Places like Australia, the USA, Canada, Germany as well, that have had fairly recently big historical events, or that are fairly new countries, are generally more low context because they've had to find ways to communicate very directly and very quickly and shortcut all of that historical building up to, a big culture that they share.
So how are you managing to do what you do, your consultancy, all of this whilst we're in lockdown? Is it affecting you badly?
Trying to get things online, yeah, it has affected, because a lot of the work that I do is generally they're big training sessions. They're 3 or 4 hours, minimum. And really translating that into an online format is really difficult, which I'm sure most people are learning as well. So what I've done is adapt a lot of things into very short 1-hour webinar sessions. There's also things like I was participating in a big conference that was going to be 5 days, and we're now just going to do 5 45-minute slots spread over 5 days. So yeah, it's just learning to adapt things. I mean, there's a lot of things that have disappeared. There's a lot of work that I was doing with some universities, which, until further notice are all on hold, which is a shame, because you start to, and I'm sure it's the same with everyone, isn't it? You start to develop things and you have a project going, and when it comes to a sudden halt, it's really quite difficult. But luckily I have a very tech savvy brother that I can call on to help with such things. So yeah.
He is one of our subs partners, isn't he? So I've got to say nice things about him and agree with you.
Okay, he's been very helpful. But yes, it's just translating it into that webinar format, really. And actually, I mentioned this to you another day, David, didn't I? That learning how to use Zoom through one of the webinars that you offered was so helpful, because it's very strange starting to do these things online and get comfortable with that format and feel comfortable enough to run a session as well, because you've got to make sure you know how things work.
Yeah, but we did a lot of Zoom out sessions. We've helped quite a few people transition. Obviously, we had to do our own bit of transitioning as well, but if we've helped you along the way, that's a complete bonus. So what are your longer term plans then? If this is your chosen route of what you're going to be doing for the foreseeable future, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
So longer term plans are, I am currently developing quite a lot of work around inclusive recruitment. So using all of that knowledge and experience that I've got in those different areas and applying it specifically to companies who want to recruit more inclusively, to make sure that we have a lot more diversity within our companies and within our workplaces, because that in the future is going to be really, really important. The world's getting smaller. We need to understand how we can support each other better. So a lot of the work has been translated into that. That's part of a bigger project where we will start to be accrediting companies around the UK based on a framework that we've set up to see how supportive they are of diversity and inclusion initiatives, which nowadays are a really big part of most companies' CSR, so their corporate social responsibility efforts. Lots of them have diversity and inclusion agendas as well, so it all feeds into that. So.
Okay, well, I'm not very good at being politically correct, and I apologise
if I'm
fine. But if you've got a company of 100 people and you have, obviously, within a given area, you may have a larger ethnic minority or a small ethnic minority. But this is where I struggle, because if I've got 100 staff, whether none of them are in the ethnic minority or half of them are, I would like to think that people are only employing people who are right for the job without the unconscious bias. And I'm sure the fact that you use the word unconscious means maybe we're not. But employing someone from a minority group or someone that you think we might have bias towards for the sake of doing it to raise your numbers as a business, as in, it must be a very grey area.
It is, and actually, so there's a few different things that feed into that, really. So one of the big things is, like you say, it is unconscious, and I really think people need to remember that. None of this is because people are bad people or aware of the fact that they're doing it. One of the really big areas that you can work on around inclusive recruitment is simply people do not apply for jobs because they think, I'm not welcome there, because they can't see themselves represented in that company. So I did a project recently with a very big construction company called Lango Rourke, and they were working very closely with the Manchester International Festival. And one of the things that the International Festival did recently to try and engage different people was put up the adverts for their job. Well, it's really an apprenticeship, but put it the adverts for the jobs that they had on offer in chicken shops. Because what they were trying to do was engage with a new group of people that previously hadn't worked with them before. So they got quite a lot of younger candidates applying for that. Okay. And really, that's something that we can do, because it's not that we are consciously saying, I don't want you in my company. It's that people are not putting themselves up for these types of jobs. So they're not including themselves in the arena where they really should be including themselves. And we have to play a big part in that, in terms of how we present job descriptions, in terms of how we present job interviews as well, and try and make people feel welcome within those companies. And another thing that's really important, you mentioned, David, if you work in an area where you have a large percentage of an ethnic minority, for example, each company, as much as it possibly can, should be a reflection of the society, so the society around them. So yeah, there will be areas where you have more representation of one group than another, simply because of where you are, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
I was just trying to research a name of someone, but Fresh Networking is a
Yes,
networking
yes,
group I've kind of only been on once, I must confess, but some of our sub-partners have been very active with Fresh Walks. And
yeah,
the thing for me, which was brilliant, was the fact that when you go to an ordinary networking event, you can kind of sometimes spot the accountants and the solicitors and the everything else. But when you went on this one, everyone's in walking gear.
yeah,
Everyone is literally looks the same. So you don't know if
yeah,
someone is the CEO of a top multi-million international company, or
yeah,
actually they just run their own business. And it was very leveling. It was
yeah.
a very interesting position to be in.
Yeah, and it's really lovely, isn't it, to meet people like that because you just have normal conversations with them. It's you're not walking into an event and going, okay, so he's more important than him, and you're saying, oh, great, this is lovely. They're people, and that's what it is at the end of the day. Remembering that everyone is just a different person,
I like that.
regardless of the job
Yeah,
title.
they're people. Okay,
Yeah,
we're all people, and at the end of the day, and we're all different, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you, but obviously,
No,
unconscious
thank you.
bias is something that's in the out there at the moment. I don't know how much it's filtered down to smaller businesses, but I know a lot of the large corporates
Yeah,
are facing this on a daily basis. So, is your
yeah,
target audience those corporates, or are you still doing work? You mentioned education earlier,
yeah.
universities, schools. Uh, Obviously, they have to be very careful with inclusion and everything they
Yeah.
do. So, who's your target audience?
David, when I work that out, I'll let you know. I mean, really, the big thing about this is it's applicable to everybody. So generally, very, very small companies don't have these issues because they're too small to need to worry about such things. And very, very large corporates have their own internal systems to deal with this. So SMEs, which covers, of course, an enormous area, are really the people to be supporting with it. I do also, like you just mentioned, I said before, do a lot of work within education. And one of the big things that I really struggle with is wanting to support universities and people in education and finding how willing they are to do that. So a lot of it is lip service because, of course, they need to be seen to be doing things. And this happens as well in private companies. But I think in private companies, because they can see the benefit, the business benefits, and actually the financial benefits of being more inclusive, it's a lot easier to deal with. Whereas within the university setting, you have a lot of academics who believe that they know better. And in most cases they do, but they're not acting on what they know. And it's kind of very difficult sometimes to really engage with them and get them to see that they need to be changing things. There's a huge problem in universities within the UK, and this is across the UK, it's a national issue, around the attainment gap, and that is the grades that different people are getting. So anybody who is not white generally gets a lower grade, and most universities have set themselves a goal of 2024 or 2025 to try and deal with that, and that includes racial differences, people who have disabilities, people who are mature students, and the grades that they get for some unexplained reason are considerably lower than everybody else. But of course, that has a huge impact when people start to look for jobs. So that, I think, is an area that I would love to focus on a lot more and really try to help people work through that and find solutions to that. But it's whether or not we can do that.
Well, best of luck from all of us at Subs
Thank
and
you.
myself. I hope you
Thank
make
you.
a long and lasting career out of it. If people want to contact
Thank
you,
you.
Kelly, what's the best way of doing so?
LinkedIn, or they can on the website as well. Send me a quick email.
Okay,
But yeah,
so looking up
LinkedIn
Kelly
is
Noon on the
perfect.
website, on the
Indeed.
LinkedIn, it's Kellie.
Indeed, Kellie
Yes,
Noon,
I
or
thought
most people at Subs know Jack. No, so most people can either find me through Jack at Subs,
Jack
or
is
go
one
onto
of
LinkedIn
your
as well.
partners. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
So, Kelly, maybe you're going to come and join us at some of our future events
I
as well.
will. I will. Thank
Well,
you very much.
pleasure talking to you. Stay there, and
Indeed.
I'm going to stop the recording now. Hopefully, everyone has enjoyed listening to Kellie Noon, and we will be back talking with some more people in hopefully just a few days. Thank you for staying with us.